Welcome to Conversatio, the Belmont Abbey College podcast. This podcast aims to form and transform our community so that each of us can reflect God's image. I'm your host, Chris Egan, and today I'm joined by John Barry III, author of Why Can't I?, as well as Daniel Hutchinson, an associate professor of history here at Belmont Abbey College. We're excited to be talking to John about his book, Why Can't I? But before we get started, I'll let John and Daniel more fully introduce themselves. John, how about we start with you?
Say thank you so much. I do appreciate this, and I'll just say I know my father is gleaming from ear to ear, and my mother will have a very beguiling smile. She didn't like big smiles. She liked very, and I went to Belmont Abbey from 62 to 64, and you had mentioned, I won't go on too much, the Abbey had really not changed much from the time my father was there and when I was there. The only difference I could basically see was O'Connell Hall was new, and they still had the old baseball cement stadium behind O'Connell Hall, and there was no really any landscaping. Everything was dirt paths up and down the creek to classes, and but it was really a very grounding education for me at the Abbey. It really was.
Daniel?
Thanks, Chris. My name is Daniel Hutchinson. I'm a professor here in the history department here at Belmont Abbey, where I also direct the college's digital humanities program. I'm also an alum of Belmont Abbey. I attended from 1998 to 2002, and I've had the great fortune to be on staff here at the Abbey since 2011. And I'm excited to talk more about this book and the history behind it.
Well, John, I had the pleasure of meeting your aunt and uncle several years ago on one of my visits to D.C., and your Aunt Anne, being your father's sister, told me that her nephew John, that being you, had written a book about her brother. Then 6 months ago, you reached out to the Abbey to tell your parents' story. So, with that being said, why don't you introduce to us your book, Why Can't I?, your motivation for writing it, as well as introduce more about your father, where he was born, his family background, things like that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chris. My father was actually born in Somerville, South Carolina. The family moved to Wilmington in around 1917, and in his journal, he's got right here his service journal. He said he had attended parochial school all his life. He had elementary school in Wilmington. I'm not sure what the elementary school's name was. I've heard various accounts, but in around 14 or 15, his mom died in 1931, right during the Depression. He and his brothers and the whole family, his siblings, his 6 siblings, were sent to Nazareth Catholic Orphanage. Actually, the Catholic Orphanage. Nazareth was a town back then, and that is now where Holy Name of Jesus Cathedral is, on the same grounds. And so the only thing I can imagine, and I might jump ahead or jump back. My dad was a paper boy in Wilmington, and of course he probably read all the headlines on the paper. And of course back then, luckily for me, a lot of stuff just kind of fell into place. I don't have it with me. I thought I had it. Winston Groom's Aviators. I had read that about 10, 15 years ago, and it dawned on me that's probably where my father got his love for flying, or his inspiration. Reading about Lindbergh, reading about Rickenbacker. Of course, Doolittle came a little bit later in the scene, but I learned so much I learned that what else would a young boy reading, setting up the papers every morning, reading the paper, or in the afternoon, reading the headlines. And in the late 20s, of course, they had aerial circuses, shows and stuff like that at Blumenfield Field in Wilmington. And I'm sure there was just a natural curiosity that basically triggered his imagination. And when he when the family, his brothers and sisters, went to the Catholic orphanage, my family likes to call it Nazareth School because they don't like to say orphanage, but basically my grandmother had died. My grandfather was out of work in the Depression and literally had no money at all. My grandfather had worked with the Atlantic Coast Line in Wilmington, and luckily Monsignor Murphy helped at St. Mary Pro Cathedral in Wilmington, facilitated the family going to the Catholic orphanage in Nazareth. And my father was there 2 years, and my uncle told me about, apparently my father's great athletic abilities, hard work. The football team there did very well. They even beat the state championship, so the story goes, and they were really proud of themselves when they were just, in high school there at the Catholic orphanage. And I can only imagine his being an altar boy acolyte at St. Mary, and then going to the Catholic orphanage. I don't have any. I really don't have a lot of information about that or any of the fathers and what have you there, but I'm sure his guidance counselor saw his ambition and what he strived to be, and basically guided him how he got into Belmont Abbey. He didn't have a penny. They didn't have a penny at all. So it was only through his hard work and his good Irish strong back and football, athleticism, baseball, wrestling. I'm sure he got a partial, if not a full scholarship at the Abbey back then. I had called, probably 4 years ago, to the registrar at the Abbey, and they looked very, very diligently, but they said that apparently those records had been purged. So I didn't. I'd like to know what his grades were in school. If they were better, I hope they were better than mine. But anyway,
I heard he was summa cum laude, John. If that makes you feel any better.
yeah.
Actually, kind of interesting for those listening to the podcast who may not know. At that point in time, the Benedictines were the ones here at Belmont Abbey Monastery who were basically the ones who went out and serviced all the churches in North Carolina. So if you had a Catholic priest in North Carolina at the time, it was a Benedictine from the monastery here. Also, the Sisters of Mercy were the ones who ran Nazareth Orphanage or Nazareth School, as you like to call it. Yeah, and as you know, John, from your time here, the Sisters of Mercy are just down the road and open up the Sacred Heart schools. So it seems like if you were a young Catholic individual wanting to go to college in North Carolina, you had no choice but to go to Belmont Abbey College. So perhaps that's how he got in. So your father obviously knew then the value of higher education, Catholic higher education, and also, if I read the book correctly, he thought about entering the priesthood. Do you know? Does that ring a bell?
Well, oh yeah, absolutely. That's two things my mom told me that I remember. One was he did want to be a priest, and number two, that as a young age, he and his family were sent to the orphanage. And I will have to take a line out of one of our social news on MSNBC commentators, Lawrence, I think O'Connell, I believe, said every young man, including myself, wanted to be a priest. I can remember as a kid getting my shoebox and making it like an altar, and I'm sure my father did too. And as you know, you don't choose the priesthood will choose you. And I'm sure my father had great intentions of going into the priesthood. But apparently as he got older and life came along, that things changed.
So while here at Belmont Abbey, he met your mother, who went to well, from what I understand, met your mother at Sacred Heart High School, which again is just right down the road. So tell me about that relationship and how your mother wooed your father away from the priesthood.
Well, that's well, that's what I thought until I started going through my mom's yearbook at Sacred Heart, my dad's Aspire, um, all his. I've got two really hefty photo albums of him at at Nazareth and at Belmont Abbey. I've got a lot of pictures. I guess he really loved so many of his school chums and also the priests. There's Father Cuthbert, Father Biggs, Father Hayes, that my dad had taken pictures of as young monks at the Abbey in 1937, which I think is pretty cool. I didn't realize it until I was, but researching the yearbooks and my dad and looking through the photo albums, all the pictures of this one very, very attractive young lady called Rosalind Kravitz. And Rosalind was really my dad's main squeeze the whole time. Mom did not enter into, well, they knew each other, obviously, because who doesn't know each other? When you go down we'd all go down to the drugstore in Belmont, yak, yak, yak. Rosalind and my mom were best friends. In the yearbook, you know how girls write. I don't know how they write. I just have it here, what they said, how they love each other, and they're the best people in the whole world. Rosalind would go home with mom on break and vacations and what have you. And at the same time, she was dating my dad. My mom, at that time, was apparently dating a guy named Frog Gearden. His name is Bill Gearden. And now I think my father might have been a little jealous in a way, because in the yearbook right here, he writes, "There's a frog in every pond, and there's a redhead in every room." And it didn't really dawn on me what he means by a frog in every pond, but he was basically talking about Bill Gearden, who they were on the football team. They swam this. I had pictures of them at the swimming pool, at the Williamette swimming pool back in '36 and '37. But mom and my dad never dated. They knew each other very well through Rosalind, and when they graduated, they both graduated the same year in '37. Rosalind came up from Savannah to be with my dad because he graduated, and I've got his album right here. I won't go into it. His photo album. That there's one picture of my mother in her graduation gown, and about 10 pictures of Rosalind. So that kind of painted the picture for you. And but to fast forward a year or two, they kept in touch over the years. They write kind of cute little letters about their sports, the football at Carolina, or and also at my dad was at the state then, and that's how they kept in touch through the years.
And to shamefully tease your book, those who go on out and purchase Why Can't I can also see pictures of Rosalind and John's mother. Now, so in this background, and we're hearing these stories, there was something else going on in the world besides Rosalind, your mother, and your father. Daniel, if I could turn to you, and could you give kind of some history and some background of what was going on during the mid to late 1930s?
Absolutely. John's parents are living in arguably one of the most dramatic moments in world history, as the Great Depression is raging and the Second World War is on the horizon. The Great Depression hits the United States with full force in 1929, and the circumstances in John's book about the necessity of sending him to the orphanage, it was sadly a common plight, as during the Great Depression in 1933, about 27% of all North Carolinians were on direct relief or unemployed, which is just an astonishing figure. And speaks to the great challenges that everyday people had in terms of making ends meet and surviving these very difficult economic circumstances. As John and Olive graduated from Belmont Abbey and from Sacred Heart in 1937, the storm clouds of World War II are already starting to gather. In 1937, Japan invades China and sets off the conflict that John would eventually be sent to fight in. And also in that year, Italy and Germany would formally announce their military alliance, the Axis alliance. And then a year later, Austria would become the first of the nations of Europe to become part of the growing Nazi empire. And the outbreak of the Second World War would happen in September 1939. One can only imagine living through those times, reading those newspapers every day, uncertain of what the future would hold. And I think, John, your book does a great job helping us understand and get inside of the heads of your parents during this moment in history to let us see what life was like at this really dramatic and turbulent moment in history.
So, John, then, with that background, tell me what of all that we just heard led your father into military service? What branch was he in, and where did he serve?
That's a good question. My dad, as I said before, he was enthralled with flying, and the best I can suss out, one of his professors at State, I shouldn't say that. I guess everybody knew that we were eventually going to get involved in World War II. And my dad's thoughts were he wanted to serve the country, he wanted to be flying. He wanted to go actively into flying. And so when he was in 1939, he was probably, I guess, maybe a junior or senior at State. He's in a fraternity. And he joined the Army Air Cadet. But he never mentions that, the Army Air Cadet. So my uncle had to tell me that, and he made it pretty clear, as a young brother would like to squeal on his older brother. And he said, John, your father washed out on the Army Air Cadet training, I think probably in Texas. He failed his landing capabilities. And so immediately after that, going through the records, my dad went right to Glenview, Illinois, to E School and signed up in the Navy. And he finally he went through the whole Navy without any incident and got his wings, I think, in probably 1941. And they sent him to Corpus Christi, Texas, to train in S&J trainers, which is the same thing as a Texan. I forget the numbers on the Texan. And they're a two-seater. He was teaching instrument flight training, dive bombing. And he didn't like dive bombing, so he mentioned. And another interesting point is, I've got a lot of pictures of him in the area there. I won't say the Red Dragon Saloon or the Dragon Saloon. But also, too, another guy we know, a future president, was training there then. It was George Bush. And Bush, I believe, got his wings as an ensign in 1943. And I can only reference that they may have met. My dad may have trained him. They may have not. They may have met at the Red Dragon. I think it was a Red Dragon bar and saloon, where a lot of his pictures are of his teammates, and so he was hoping for in 1943 to be assigned to a carrier force, and he didn't know. He wanted to be in the new Hellcat, the F6F3 Hellcat, and I learned a lot just about the whole air group between the dive bombers and the torpedo bombers, and just basically, we all think of the Hellcat and the fighter pilot, just going out and doing dog fights, and that was all they did. To me, that's what I thought they did. Well, that was not it at all. Um, the fighters, the Hellcats, would cover, as you know, um, each each um, each division of the Hellcats would cover perhaps the torpedo bombers, which were very, very slow. They when they come into their target, slow and low, and they were just sitting ducks basically. And it was up to the fighter pilots to run cover on the airfield or whatever, um, for the torpedo bombers and the dive bombers both. So and my father was elated when he found out in 1943 that he was assigned to Fighting Squadron 15 in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And
So he did fly on aircraft carriers then.
oh yeah, absolutely.
I don't know many individuals who could not land on soft land, but could jump off and on aircraft carriers bobbing up and down in the sea. Do you know what carrier he was assigned to?
Absolutely. Let me just go back real quick. And I didn't really make it that clear. Two things I didn't really make clear because in the book was number one, why can't I, is buried in the book. You really can't see that quote, which is his famous motto. And also, two, I think if you read the book, I don't know if people could glean. Here he is, 1940, washing out, landing on on probably the Waco he was flying, the twin wing trainers, and fast forward a couple years later, he's landing on a carrier with his wheels shot out. One wheel is shot out, and he did a one wheel landing on the Essex, June 13th, 1944, after I bet he had shot out his hydraulics. But we'll go back. I'll go back and we'll talk about how my mother got caught up in the whole scenario, which is pretty interesting, I think. I learned so much from it just fell into place. Everything kind of fell into place. A friend of my mom's told me that when I saw her in the convalescent home, very outspoken, good friend of mom's in childhood, and she said, "You know, Johnny, I'm the one that got your mother and father together." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah. I mean, your mother was talking so much about the boys at Belmont Abbey, probably Beer Gearden too. Maybe she didn't have Bill's address because I didn't see any letters from him. And so Mom wrote him a letter, and in probably July of 1943 invited my dad up to Pinehurst from Texas, which he did. And 1 month later, they were married, September 24th, 25th, 1943. And but they had kept in touch with cute little letters, razzing each other about their football teams and stuff like that through the years, just to keep on tabs. And as I had found out through the year, my mom liked his kind of personality, the very quirky, charming personality. She didn't go for the very quiet, smart ones at all. She liked the big personalities. So my dad fit that schedule, fit that perfectly. And just real quickly, I've found that through my life, I've probably got myself into trouble for talking too much, and now I can see where I got it from. My father's, some of the things he would write to my mom in his letters, on when he was deployed on an aircraft carrier shipping out. I thought, oh my God, I can't believe you said that. But in any case, he was his personality was a real character. It really was. He was nonstop. He really was.
So switching, and I'd like to get back to his character in just a few minutes, but switching to the aircraft carrier and the Essex, Daniel, would you know what role did that play in the Pacific theater?
It's in the center of action. It is deployed to the Pacific in 1943 at a critical turning point in the war against Japan. The United States, after the shocking events of Pearl Harbor, was able to muster its forces and defeat the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway. And the strategy from then on out was known as the island hopping campaigns. Across the Pacific, the Japanese had created these island fortresses, which were meant to slow down any potential American advance across the Pacific to dislodge the Japanese. Each island was often outfitted with a contingent of soldiers and supplies and orders to fight to the last man. And many of you have watched the film Saving Private Ryan, where the soldiers stormed the beaches there at Normandy under withering fire. In the Pacific, there were a lot of D-Days, as each one of these island chains had to be liberated one by one by American forces. John's father's role in this was flying the, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, but the Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters, which were an important part of the Essex's contingent of aircrafts on this aircraft carriers. About 36 of those, according to the records we have, that were on this aircraft carrier. And the mission of the aircraft carrier was to provide support to other ships, to provide air cover for landing troops, to attack Japanese shipping and Japanese planes. And the Essex is everywhere in this Pacific campaign. They're some of the biggest battles for Tarawa, for the Marshall Islands, for against Truk and Tinian and Saipan and Guam. I mean, these are all big battles, and the Essex is there for all of them. The Essex is in September 1944 supporting efforts for the liberation of the Philippines when John's father's plane is destroyed in attacks against Japanese shipping, it appears, against Mindanao and one of the main Pacific islands. So in terms of the role of the Essex during the Pacific front during World War II, it's front and center. John saw it all in terms of his service to the country and to the work that he did in fighting for freedom in the Pacific.
So John, the book Why Can't I is composed a lot of letters from your father to your mother. So in being all that Daniel talked about the Essex was involved in, he still found time to write letters.
Every night.
Is there anything that you can tell us about that, how we found the time? And one of the interesting facts I saw in the book was there would almost be a description of what he did that day, and then that evening would be the letter. And it was like two completely different worlds during the day.
Exactly. Well, that's what's really interesting. And you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly correct. I've got, like, his first day of battle was like May 19th, I believe, in Marcus, when they had heavy aircraft and anti-aircraft fire, and he part of his wing got hit, wing on his Hellcat, and he was scared breathless. He said it was so bad, as you probably read, he could hardly catch his breath. He was so frightened. He didn't say frightened, but in any case, that's he was in the Battle of the Philippines, the Turkey shoot. He did not get out. He was not involved in the dogfights and what have you. I guess he said he spent 8 hours flying cover for the aircraft carrier at that point. But he going back to my main ambition was to write about him, because everybody else in the family had their story. No one really knew his story as much as I had gleaned from Mom's and his letters. And as I was writing it, as the chapters rolled out, a good friend who was basically my editor, helping me clean up my texts, and she said, this is a beautiful love story. It really is. And it's not a love story. I'm not writing about a love story. I'm writing about my dad. Anyway, now I look at it, knowing what my dad would have thought, he would much rather have it about what we call his pinup girl and doll baby, my mother, about her and him, rather than just about him. And I think he'd be very happy to see how this love story, which it turned out to be, came about. Um, and it just wasn't about him. Um, and he was much more. Um, his letters were fantastic. It taught me so much about uh, who he was, how he was. You know, he went to mass. You know, every day when he could. Um, he even served mass and every day, or when he could, and on the Essex. And but yeah, I found it very. I learned so much about both of them. As you can imagine, as myself growing up with my mother, I knew her as my mother. I didn't see her as a young, vibrant young lady, crazy about this guy named John Barry. And the same thing with my dad. Um, I we all could learn from him just how to treat people. I mean, that sounds. I don't mean to sound kind of like that, but he was so. They both called each other darling. They gave each other so much love and support, and also too when he was in Maui at Panini, which is basically your Top Gun training in April and May of '44. Their letters were really good because they would get letters every week on a regular basis, so they could kind of work on a conversation. And he said he felt very close. He said when he'd get his letters from my mom, he would take them into the chapel there in Maui and read the letters because they were so heartfelt and meant so much to him. But yeah, it's a good love story. And
So, so you started out to do one project, but it kind of fell into learning more about the history. Daniel, being a historian, how important is it to keep history alive in things like this?
Well, it's critical. And I think John's book gives us vivid insight into history's value. He was trying to uncover um, the story of his father and the story of his family. I suspect it made you think a lot about the forces that shaped their life, what sort of people they wanted to be, and maybe who we want to be in the future. The study of the past helps us understand both the brilliance and the horribleness of those folks in the past, and maybe provide us inspiration and guidance towards building a better future. The past, in and of itself, is very helpful for us to get a good grounding in how things work, but I think it is also constructive for us to help build a better future. And I think that's one important value for why we should keep history alive.
the and I'll just board it in here. All the other books I read were about the air groups, and most of the books were gleaned just basically from naval records. They really weren't dug out from personal journals and what have you. Um, a couple things I liked that I found out, or one thing that the Catholic priest, which I don't know if you guys knew this or not. Well, if you read the book, you know. He would stand on the flight deck as the air group took off and landed, and gave them conditional absolution every day, every time they took off and landed. And I didn't know that. There's so much I don't know, but I did learn so much about, and I think that's very important. I didn't even know that. And he was, of course, he was very close to the pastor there on board the carrier, and probably for good reason. The pastor was a great cook, so he had some great meals, and he loved to play bridge. But yeah, I really was kind of like, wow, that's pretty cool. I didn't know that in all the history channels and stuff like that, they never reference the fact that um, the Catholic pastor, the priest, was on the flight deck when they were taking off and giving all the airmen, conditional absolution, which I thought was I found it very intriguing. I really did.
So it sounds like through this whole process, you've learned so much more about your father, in reading the letters, in learning these stories about the Catholic priests on the flight deck and all that. And I know you came to the Abbey for a couple years as a student, and then you were just on campus when we met just a short time ago. How tell us about that? How was that experience of being back and knowing all this about your father?
When I enrolled there in 1962, I felt very grounded. I don't think I could have ever made it in a big school like UNC or State, coming from a small town. And we were talking earlier, a couple months ago, Pat O'Leary, who was a senior when I was there. Now, Pat O'Leary, and I'm going to jump ahead real quick and come back. Pat O'Leary, Frog, Peanut, Davison, all caught up. Also Mahoney Ray, were all my dad's classmates. They all caught up in Enoch in the Marshall Islands back in August of '44, which I thought that was pretty cool. I mean, I just find it phenomenal that his classmates and from the Abbey, they all kind of like run into each other out there in the Marshall Islands, and when they were refueling or what have you, relooting. So yeah, and but the Abbey is pretty much the same when I was there. Like I said, the only thing difference was O'Connell Hall was new. The baseball field was gone. It was just a parking lot, and the old cement structure was still there when I was there. And yeah, so it really hadn't changed much when I was there. Now, when I saw you guys there a couple months ago, I was blown. If the Abbey was like this, I would have never left. I mean, number one is co-ed now. Before it was just boys, guys, and they're all from New Jersey and New York. Which no offense if you're from New Jersey or New York, but that's why they were sent to the Abbey to keep them in line back then. And I really enjoyed being there. It was just like, oh my God, I can't believe how beautiful the campus is. Where the parking lot now is, I guess, is where there's like a courtyard and off to one area is where the bell is, and then you have your new dormitories going in. And I just found out listening to the Abbott's podcast from a couple of months ago that O'Connell Hall, I guess, was named after I guess, is it Lawrence and
Father Jeremiah O'Connell.
Yeah, and now if we knew, I don't think they ever told us that, which had been nice, and I'm sure I had forgotten.
John, they probably told you.
You're probably right. And but yeah, I've been listening to the Abbott's podcast, and I really enjoyed that. I really did, and I learned so much. But yeah, the Abbey had not changed much when I was there, and again when I was there a couple months ago, it was gorgeous, and I love your St. Joseph's Adoration Chapel. That is gorgeous. It really is.
Well, for those of you listening to this podcast, seeing this podcast, you're welcome to come visit the college at any time. It is going through much growth as we continue to grow and expand and live out the mission that Father Jeremiah O'Connell wanted to have done at this place back in 1876. So in wrapping this up, any final thoughts?
Again, I just thank you so much. I know my mom and dad would be so appreciative, and myself as much, for having this moment with you guys. And I appreciate Daniel and Sarah and Chris especially so much for having me here. It means a lot. It really does. And I said the biggest thing is you have to cut me off because I can talk forever. Unfortunately for you guys. So.
Well, as we wrap this up, I also like to thank the audience for joining us, and to thank you and John and Daniel for taking your time. Again, the book is Why Can't I by our guest, John Barry III. If you enjoy Conversatio, please subscribe and tell your friends. And Conversatio is available on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. Until next time, God bless.